Welcome to the multiplier field training video for Ricochet. Now, this is implementing fields into Ricochet, which is just inherently one of the more complex options that we have when it comes to how you can interact with Ricochet. So let's do the simplest possible version. Starting out, let's make a matrix object. 100 by 1 by 1, so we have exactly 100 different clones all facing on Z positive. Now, creating a extension or plugin Ricochet, I can feed into the orientation. It'll actually be a matrix object. I like this matrix I just made. And we're going to get 100 different segments, all kind of different lasers shooting out from it, generated by Ricochet. Now, inherently, these aren't doing any bouncing or anything. They're just making straight lines. Of course, Ricochet can bounce off anything we feed it. If I wanted to, I could create a sphere, put the sphere in as a child of it. Now those are bouncing in the interior. I could move it on the outside. Now they're bouncing off the outside of it. We could scale this up and put a bunch more segments to really smooth that out, and that will be bouncing off all of those different parts. Yes, it can do that, but we're going to keep it nice and simple. It'll just be these straight line segments. Just to stay organized, I'll drop the matrix as a child of the Ricochet, select Ricochet, and then in the Modifier tab, we will find the Multiplier field. Twirling that down, we'll see that we have a field list, just like all the Mograph tools do, and a multiply. Currently it's multiplying none, but you'll see inside that we can multiply by the length, growth, offset, or rate. Back in the main tab, you'll see that we are currently using the length. If we twirl it down, we see growth and offset and rate, but currently we're using length. So we'll stay on that. If we hit play, nothing's happening. It's very static. With that in mind, in Modify, we can start dropping in any field that we like. In this case, keep it as simple as possible by adding in a linear field. The linear field is currently on X, and as long as we tell this to multiply by the length is now multiplied by this linear field. I can drag this out. We can see a perfect fall off of the length as this value is multiplied on whatever our length value is. Now, of course, we can now add all the complexities that come along with fields, all the cool options and features. Let's add a random field on top of it, set that to overlay, and now this will randomly overlay on top of the linear field. Setting the random field, it's currently on noise, but let's give it some animation speed of 55, hitting play. Now those will be wiggling up and down on top of the overlay of this linear field. So I could animate this linear field through, each of them will grow, and we'll now finally see that end result as they all get combined all the way up to 100%. That's a cool option. We can do that right away. And you can even do the more complex things that fields enable you to do. Things like the decay and delay. Let's do a decay to start out with. I'm going to say, hey, maximum. What this means is if it wiggles and it happens to go up to a higher point, the maximum won't allow it to go down lower. So we can put a little bit of fade in there, and now they'll shoot up and then want to stay near that higher value until they slowly fade down to some original number and then continue moving. So those can combine in these more complex ways with all of the different fields. So that's a decay. Deleting the decay, I'll add in a delay instead. And the delay usually, well, it defaults to smooth, but you'll know it better from its springiness. I'll turn off this clamp so that it's able to overshoot. We should see that as it gets to a peak that these can wiggle a little bit. We can add in a whole bunch of springiness now. So those should hit the peak and then wiggle around the top and then move down and wiggle. So lots of extra springiness from that. And these can combine in all sorts of different ways. Let's delete everything and think about adding in something onto maybe growth. Let's add in, well, we still need some length, so say 100, but now we'll use growth instead. Actually, we don't need any length if we're using growth, so we'll say 100. And if we hit play, it's now going to be animating at a constant rate slowly out. So let's go back into the modify. Change this to growth mode, and let's add a new random back in, and now you can see that it's growing, but they're each growing by a different length. Now this will still grow forever. I can just drag, and all this is pre-calculated, so I can drag this out and you see that each one grows at a different length, and that could be animated. Again, set that to back to 55, and now you'll see that the different growth lengths are completely different. This can now be applied to every different mode. Let's change this to a offset concept. That will require no growth and we'll need some offset. So I'll say we'll offset by 100 and we need some length to see something. So now these are wiggling around just a little bit. There's not very much offset, so I'll say 1000 instead. And now you can see that the offset is getting multiplied. We can see a little bit of offset and everything. So that could be on top of a rate. So let's rewind all the way. And now there's a rate constantly moving. So offset is added on top of that. And now they're kind of stepping their way away from the origin. Then that is rate, that's offset. Let's add some rate. I'll say 1000 on rate, which means all of these will be constantly moving forward. And that same thing can be applied. We'll set this to rate. And now multiplying rate, we're going to have a different speed moving forward, but it's animated, so those slowly sometimes go back, sometimes go forward. Every possible combination can be fed in here. Any field fall off, we can drag in a cube, we can drag in a spline, we can add on any of the modifier layers, any of the field layers, any of the field objects. Any combination that you want to do here with rate can go nuts. Now, I expect most people aren't going to use this. Most people aren't going to use it most of the time. And every once in a while, you might have a complexity that you need to add this in as an additional variable. So why don't we take a look at maybe just a crazy array. We'll just make something up as we go and try and make something nuts. Let's start completely from scratch. So deleting out that Ricochet, I'm going to paste in from my clipboard. I've still got that head from earlier. So with that there, what if we make a kind of that shockwave effect? We'll make a whole series of layers of them and then start driving that through fields. So my thought is, what if I make a, well, let's do it real basic. If we make a matrix, we can set that to a radial, and now we have 100 in a radial. Well, if we want a bunch of stacks of that, well, my brain immediately goes to creating a cylinder, turning off the caps. I would now like to have this matrix reference that cylinder. So mode, object, look at the cylinder. It's set to surface, which is cool, but I actually want to do either polygon center, edge, or vertex. In this case, I'll say vertex. And you can see every single point gets 1. So now I've kind of got a radial, but I've got a series of height segments to also control that. So I will say I want a rotational segments of 100. So that was 100, and then we have 4 stacks of it. The radius can be real small. We could probably go down to, I don't know if 0 is a good idea. We can try it. Yeah, I think 0 won't work, but we could go as small as 0.001. So super duper tiny. And those are all in position now, but I think even 1 is small enough for our purposes. And I would like to position this cylinder so it's kind of fitting perfectly within the head. So I'll move it forward a little bit, and it's a little bit tall. So just make it not quite as tall. Cool. And with that, we can make as many stacks of this as we want, and we'll be changing that as we go. I'll make the cylinder a child of the matrix. We don't need to visually see or render it. And with that built, I would like to make a Ricochet. Back to the main tab of it. I want there to be, I don't want to be creating it from Z+. I would like it to be based off a matrix. We've got a matrix to feed in. And now every single matrix becomes a new starting point of a Ricochet. Once again, to be organized, I'll drop the matrix as a child of the Ricochet. And then inside of Ricochet, in order so that the Ricochet is doing something fancy, I'd like this to be terminating the object. So under modify, I will say, hey, if you collide with the head, then the line will end. So now you can see we have a stack of these all shooting outward. And of course, going back to the matrix, actually back to the cylinder, I can increase the segment, the height count. And you'll see that we'll get more stacks. I would like to see the Ricochet, so I'll change this to on, and now we've got some white lines if I have it deselected. So that should be taking on the shape of the object. Temporarily, I'll hide the model so we can just see all of the Ricochet lines as they are filling up the overall space. So inside of Ricochet, how about we do that shockwave effect in general? So what do we need for that? Well, we need some length, so I'll say 50 again, just like before, an offset of 50. And that is going to just have it be offset. And that's honestly all that I need to do here, because we'll drive the rest inside of the field layer. Inside of here, I'd like to be driving the offset. We want to drive it how? Well, we have a bunch of options. First of all, I could say just make a linear field and set that to Y. And now as I drag that linear field, those are going to offset as it just passes through. But something that's pretty neat and incredibly powerful in this context is we could add in a time field layer. Adding in time, set that to normal, and I'm going to unclamp this so it can go above 100 and below 0. And what time is going to do is travel forward forever, and every 30 frames it's 100%, and at 60 frames it would be 200%. It's just going to keep on going. So if I were to hit play here, it should keep on pushing our offset outward forever. Of course, after a little while we won't see anything. So how about looping this? We can do that by saying shape sawtooth, which is a line that will shoot up and then drop down, and then just repeat that. So if I say sawtooth, now we see them go out and then reset every 30 frames. Now, as we saw in our other shockwave example, we need to do a negative offset in order to see this. So the way I will represent that here is remapping this time. Currently, this is outputting 0 up to 100 and then looping. So if I were to create a remap, or I'm sorry, a range map, create a range map, I can say, okay, it's inputting 0 to 100, and it's going to loop that. Now I'm going to say, actually, I want this to go from negative 100 up to, I'm not sure, maybe 200 or maybe 300. I think 200 will probably cover us. So say 200. So now if I rewind and hit play, now it's going to go out and loop again and again. And because I did that negative 100%, that's negative 100, multiplying on this 50, which would now be 50 and negative 50, which is our formula for completely erasing something out. So when it's at that looping point, it'll be grown exactly 0, and then it'll grow, go way out, and then erase out and repeat again and again and again and again. So now you can see we've got this nice looping animation of a shockwave. Of course, this is all still live. Let's give that pause, rewind, and go to whatever frame I would like. Let's say that the cylinder has a couple extra segments, so we'll stack up a few extra, and now we can see we've got extra stacks there. But they're all doing the exact same thing at the exact same time. It is taking on the shape of the head overall, but I would like to get a little bit more variation in what's happening. So along those lines, what if we go back into our Ricochet, into those fields, and change the timing somehow? One idea would be going inside of time, and time itself has an offset. So inside of there, dropping a linear field. We'll see it best if we put that to Y. And now, and actually, let's go to a side view and make our linear field, make sure I have the linear field selected. Make sure that the linear field is kind of mapping exactly onto the length, so we're getting kind of that full range. And now if I hit play, we'll see that they are each offset from each other. Now I'm noticing that, oh, I should probably make that a child of the offset, and now we'll see it even better. Now, we are seeing it cycle down through because this linear field is offsetting of the time that's fed in. So now we've got this constant wave traveling down. So that's a really cool effect already, and it's taking on the shape of the overall object. I like it. Think of all the different combinations we can do here. This is a constant time pushing outward, but I could grab time and say, actually, you're not a sawtooth, you are a sine wave. So now they'll go out and in, and they're still offset by that linear field. So we'll have this constant animation. So this is really cool for doing some sort of FUI type of interface graphics. Then let's see, what can we do? Let's go back to the sawtooth because it's just very controllable. We can see what's happening. Let's add a little bit of additional variation through randomness. Another random field. I'll drop that into the time offset. Temporarily, we'll turn off the linear field, so we're just seeing what this random does. Now, this is based off of a noise, and it's relatively large, so you'll see that each of these is kind of offset. But if we make this smaller, it can begin to affect them individually. So at 10%, yeah, 10% is pretty cool. Look at these little individual waves that we have coming out. So we could take that and animate it. So slowly over time, those are changing, so we never quite get the same burst that we got before. And now take this overall setup and multiply it, or overlay. Let's see, do I want to multiply? I'll say multiply. So we'll multiply that on the linear field, and now we get this burst traveling down, and we get that variation. But of course, we could say overlay, completely different way of them mapping on each other. We just get that little bit of variation on how they're pushing out. And now this linear field is currently traveling from the top to the bottom, but we could, of course, grab that and invert it by saying Y minus. So now it travels upward. And then we could go into remapping. And my favorite remapping under contour is setting it to curve. And we can remap this curve however we like. So what if this goes to a peak and then it goes back down again? So now you'll see it's actually, let's start from the beginning, and you can see it's kind of an origin in the middle and then pushes out in both directions. We'll see that a little bit more clearly if I turn off the random field. So you can see how they're bursting out. You can see how those are bursting out in those orientations. It'll be a little more clear if we make this a little more linear looking. There we go. So you can kind of see that pattern traveling up and down at the same time. So bringing back in that random field to multiply it, get that variation. And again, this entire rig, parametric, we can change anything that we like about it. We can put more stacks in the cylinder. So let's make there be 22 going upward. Maybe we'll make slightly fewer around. So we'll say 50 just so we can see the individual ones. And now they're bursting up, going down, and just repeating the pattern, taking on the shape of the model as we're hitting it. This entire setup is currently inside of the model, but if we were to pull it outside the model, let's grab actually just the cylinder. I can move this outside of the model, and you'll see that we'll collide with the face of it, or any shape that we want to. So you can see how it's kind of erasing out the shape, or it could just be, floating standalone and be traveling and making this effect out into infinity, just getting a constant shockwave effect and any variation. Now, just think about how arbitrary this setup I just did is, where we are creating this constant cylinder wave colliding with the overall. I'll do that one more time to get it in the center. This is just a cylinder, like creating this constant wave, but think of all the different shapes. This could be traveling along a line. It could be traveling, we could be randomly moving it and rotating it. This could be any kind of model. That model could be moving. It could be layered up. So many different layers of interface graphics. There are so many opportunities to really push this far. And I mean, it just goes to like fields. Fields are like this bottomless pit of opportunity and combinations and crazy cool things you can do. So this is just one random arbitrary example of how we can drive any of the length, growth, offset, or rate and create all sorts of crazy effects on top of everything else we are already able to do. So that should wrap up this video, and I'll see you in the next one.